I'm going to talk to you today about how disruption shapers will inherit the recovery. My name's Matthew Spooner. I'm a thought leader with Kinaxis. Now, that term, in Kinaxis, I'm responsible for Kinaxis' strategy for industrial and high-tech organizations. I also do a lot of research around sales and operations planning and how in supply chain we need to work with the CFO and the other C-suite within those organizations. Now, in the past, I joined Kinaxis 9 months ago. Before that, I was the group function head of planning and fulfillment in ABB. I spent some time in Gartner, and most of my career was actually in Ericsson. So my career has primarily been operational, where I've had operational decisions up to VP level within large corporations. And my passion is triathlon, and I'm a world-class triathlete. I very much enjoy doing triathlons. Just a very quick, this is the only slide I'm going to put up about Kinaxis. In Kinaxis, we're a supply chain planning vendor. We have about 1,400 employees, although it's still growing very fast. We operate in 30 different countries. We have 8 offices around the world, and we have one product. We have a single code base. It's highly configurable, but we don't customize the code base for anyone. So any customization that is done within the product is available to every single one of our customers around the world. Now, I'm going to start off. So this is a picture of the building. Now imagine that this building is my company, my organization. And so if I'm the CEO of this organization, I own and run this building, what are the things that I'm really interested in? I'm really interested in having a nice, flashy car. Or in actually the CEO's really of an organization is really interested in how they're going to, the mergers and acquisitions, how they're going to grow their business. They're interested in the flashy external things. What if I'm the CFO? Well, the CFO, I'm really interested in the inside of the building, having the best possible kitchen. Everything is really smart. And actually, the CEO quite likes that as well. They want a really nice, flashy kitchen, nice, really flashy interior of their building. So what about the CIO? CIO wants everything to be supplied by Bosch. They want consistency. We can have same maintenance contracts. It's a great, reliable product. We want everything to be the same. So what now about the chief supply chain officer? Supply chain is the plumbing. It's the heating. Okay, it's really important that our building is kept nice and warm, but does the CEO really want to spend money on the heating system? Does the CFO really want to spend money on the heating system? No, not really. It's the really unexciting part of the business. But that's the position where we're in within the supply chain. Now, just want to talk to you about some of the research that's been done recently. So late last year, The Economist published a report, a CEO's report, and it highlighted that 70% of CEOs of this, I think around 1,000, 1,100 CEOs were surveyed as part of this. About 70% of them said that supply chain shortages had impacted their business's revenue by up to 10%. About 40% said between 0 and 5%, and about 30% said between 5 and 10%. In the last year, supply chains had a really big impact on companies' revenue. But by and large, it wasn't that big an issue because the economies were doing quite well. Most companies still met their financial targets. They still were able to report to the market that they were doing okay. But actually, most CEOs knew that their organizations had been constrained by supply chain performance. So CEOs are now really interested in how the supply chains are performing. This is not a situation that can go on that's acceptable. Most organizations have been trying to source chips in the last 12 months. Shortages in the chip industry have cost the auto industry $209 billion. Let this sink in for a minute. That's due to failures in the supply chain, failures in the planning. I look at another data point. AlixPartners do a disruption index. They look at a number of different factors and look at how has disruption changed and how is it changing on a year-by-year basis. And what you can see is blue is where the disruption index was in 2021, and red is where the disruption index was in 2022. In every single sector, the disruption index either stayed the same or went up. It actually stayed the same in healthcare and life sciences, which was already really high, and it also stayed, I think, the same in energy and power generation, where the disruption was already really high. The level of disruption, 2021 to 2022, increased substantially. And if you speak to people, and there's some other data points there from the World Economic Forum, from MIT, for example, most people who are looking at the supply chains say, disruption is going to continue to increase probably for the next 2 to 3 years. What we're seeing at the moment is disruption is the new norm, but it's not disruption staying at the same level. We're probably going to see disruption increasing. Just the trouble is we don't know where disruption is going to come from. But part of what I'm going to talk to you today about is we can look at disruption in two ways. We can look at disruption and to say, how am I going to get through the next year? And I've known many supply chain leaders. And in the last 2 to 3 years, so many of my peers have actually decided to retire or get out of the industry or, like me, move out of operational positions more to a slightly less stressful position. It's been an incredibly stressful period in the last few years, and this level of stress is going to continue. So we could say with this disruption, we're going to be buried by the stress of it all, or we can be a very innovative organization and think, with every disruption, there comes a huge opportunity to gain market share, to go and beat our peers, to beat the other organizations. And what I want you to think about today is about how do we use disruption as a means of, as an opportunity to become better. And when we talk about disruption, it's not just about things like the war in the Ukraine. It's not just about COVID. That's the River Rhine last summer. I think for one of the first, I think it's the second time in 50 years, that the River Rhine got so low that they couldn't use it for shipping, for transportation in Germany. We're getting disruptions. These type of disruptions are coming from environmental disruptions as well as economic disruptions and geopolitical disruptions. We know that we're heading into time of recession, and this is data from Gartner, looking at Gartner's survey on CEOs, what's their intention to invest in digital technologies and digital platforms. And what you can see going forward is that, that pretty much in all sectors, there's still an acceleration of digitization. So most organizations recognize that they still need to invest in digital, even if there's going to be a recession. So everyone recognizes that, but they're still saying we need to invest in digital. Now, why is this really important for the supply chain? When we're talking about digitization, we're not just talking about digitization in the supply chain. Everyone else has got their own digitization projects. HR have got their digitization projects. Finance have got their digitization projects. Everyone is trying to go after finite resources. So we need to make sure that, if you're looking to digitize your supply chain, if you're looking to become a disruption shaper, you need to identify what's the business case? How are you going to convince the business, the CEO, the CFO, that they're going to invest in the supply chain? A quote from John Allen Paulos. Uncertainty is the only certainty there is. And knowing how to live with insecurity is the only security. And that, I think, describes very much what the environment looks like today. So incrementalism is a race to mediocrity. Now, this might sound strange coming from a software vendor, but the problem that we have as organizations is not the technology that we're using. The problem that we have as organizations is actually the techniques that we're using within our organizations. We're using supply chain planning, supply chain management techniques that fundamentally haven't changed a huge amount in the last 30 years. If you look at, people who've been in the industry long enough, if you look at how we used to run supply chains 30 years ago, they're still very similar to the way that we run supply chain today. Yes, we have a bit more digital technology, but we still rely very much on Excel. We still rely on the same processes, the same linear type of processes, the same sales and operations planning, supply planning, demand planning, financial reconciliation, running everything through MRP. Not much has changed. And actually, if we just digitize those same processes and just replicate those processes in new technology and new platforms, all we're doing is just a race to mediocrity. We're just doing what we've always done, but maybe doing it a little bit faster. And what we need to do is to rethink our approach and actually to say, are there better ways of managing the supply chain? Now, this is a pretty common picture that most of you will recognize, the IT architecture in any of your organization with demand planning, event planning, supply planning, production planning, inventory planning, all of these as separate systems. Maybe they're part of your ERP. Maybe you've got a product like Kinaxis, which is bolted onto your ERP system. You've got a production scheduling system, and they're all connected with Excel. Well, I can certainly tell you from my own experience, these Excel spreadsheets, not only are they very unreliable and they're very slow, they are also points of power. The people who own these spreadsheets will protect these spreadsheets for all they're worth because the ownership of these spreadsheets is what's the most important thing for them in their organization. And if I ask you, do you have in your organization, hands up if you've got in your organization one spreadsheet which is got one owner which is really important within the supply chain, and everyone, it's probably got a name to this spreadsheet. It's not just called the production planning spreadsheet. It's probably got some sort of strange name, and you've got this guru who's responsible for it, and they're really important in the organization. How many of you got a spreadsheet like that in your company? I certainly did. It's a company, a $30 billion organization like ABB. These spreadsheets are how they run the supply chain. And they've got these people who protect them for all they're worth. That becomes a massive problem to actually how do you make that change. It's these spreadsheets that are actually part of the problem within the organizations. So, I'm going to talk about some of the myths versus realities and some of the things that you might have seen. And probably some of the vendors have probably told you some of these things. And I'd be interested to see what you think about what are some of those 5 common myths. The first one is increasing accuracy is more important than increasing agility. Now, Gartner do a chief supply chain officer or do a survey every year. And almost every year, they ask the chief supply chain officer, what's your most important priority? And the number one that comes up year over year over year is improving the accuracy of the demand plan. Okay? Great. We keep on saying that, and what's Einstein's definition of insanity? If we can continue doing the same things time after time and expecting different results, that's the definition of insanity. And that's what we're doing when we're looking at the demand plan. Everyone knows that we would like a better demand plan, and yet we've been trying to do this for 30 years. I don't think the demand plans have got more accurate. In fact, I think they've got less accurate because the world has become more and more uncertain. So what we need to do is we need to focus on agility. And the chief supply chain officer of Unilever said a few years ago that he wished that he'd spent, $10 on agility, he got $10 benefit from the money he spent on agility compared to $1 benefit that he spent on demand planning and planning accuracy. Focusing on agility and how to make the supply chain more agile is a really important capability. So yes, it would be great if we had a more accurate demand plan, but we need to really focus on how to be as agile as possible. Optimizing each link independently optimizes the chain as a whole. So now here's I think we know this, but most organizations have multiple different P&Ls, for example. In ABB, I had more than 3,000 different P&Ls, 500 factories. Every single factory had its own P&L. Every single factory manager used to do whatever they could do to maximize their P&L because that's how they were incentivized. The reality is that finance trumps supply chain internally in your organization every single time. That you actually have to look at the end-to-end organization and to say, yeah, we need to try and optimize the end-to-end, but somehow you need to break out of this cycle that, that finance will always trump supply chain. And there are no really easy answers to that. I think that takes a huge collective amount of, some organizations have nailed it and done it pretty well. What I can see is in consumer products organizations, I think that they realized that, looking at factories as cost centers is far more important than looking factories at profit centers, but also to start having an end-to-end picture. But the problem with having an end-to-end picture is that previous slide I showed with all the Excel spreadsheets. It's very difficult to optimize the supply chain end-to-end when you've got these islands of Excel that are creating local silos. End-to-end visibility creates understanding across and between functions. Now, I used to think this as well. All we need to do is we need to create visibility. We need to create the system, and we need to make sure that everyone is operating to the same source of the truth internally within our organization and also externally looking at our partner organizations. I've got two stories around this. The first one is internally in my organization. If I create end-to-end visibility and it shows that I'm actually, my P&L, creating that end-to-end visibility shows somebody else in my organization what I'm actually doing within my own factory or my own part of the supply chain, I'm going to feel that visibility is a direct threat to me and achieving my own objectives. So creating that visibility without actually understanding how what that visibility means can actually create a threat. And within those organizations like that, you get very senior people who will actually try and prevent that visibility from happening. They will try and prevent these projects being successful because visibility is a direct threat. Now, the next one, which is about, we talk about getting visibility of our multiple tiers in our supply chain. We know that from a sustainability perspective, we've got to get visibility of multiple tiers in our supply chain. We know that to optimize our supply chains, we've got to have demand sensing, we've got to have visibility of our customers, and we've got to have visibility of our suppliers. I was actually talking to the chief procurement officer of a multi-billion-dollar organization recently, and he said to me, look, it's all really good you talking about creating visibility down to my tier 3, tier 4 suppliers. But he said, but from a procurement perspective, I don't get it. He said, there are a few problems with creating that visibility. The first one is, why am I going to share information with my suppliers if that's going to prevent me, reduce my leverage on negotiating contracts with those suppliers. The second problem that he had with it is that if I'm talking about tier 3, tier 4 suppliers, I don't have an agreement with those tier 3. I don't have any commercial relationship with those tier 3, tier 4 suppliers. We need to have NDAs. We need to have commercial arrangements with those tier 3, tier 4 suppliers. How am I going to get that? We want visibility. You've got systems like Kinaxis, which can very easily give you that visibility, but I don't have the internal processes to be able to leverage that visibility, actually be able to get that visibility into those organizations. And then he said, and the most important one, why I don't want to get visibility of my tier 3, tier 4 suppliers is that it's going to keep me awake at night. If a supplier says they've got a problem, is that a problem that I might want to deal with? Is that a problem that's actually going to affect me and my organization, or is that something that's going to be just fixed? So how are you going to ensure, if I get all this visibility, that I'm not seeing all of these problems, and my work is just becoming even harder? And I think it's really important to think about, when we think about visibility, visibility is not just about the technology. The technology exists. That's not a problem. The problem with visibility is, how do we make sure that within these organizations that we have the processes that are set up that will actually allow us to do this and to do it successfully? AI is the silver bullet to all of today's challenges. I'm sure on all of the media, in all supply publications, all the vendors will go and tell you about how we're going to automate the supply chain, how we're going to automate planners' roles, about how AI is going to transform everything that we do in the supply chain. AI is really good at doing things like automating the obvious, about taking away repetitive tasks and allowing planners and the supply chain professionals to really add value. And that's where I think we have a tremendous opportunity with AI. AI is really good at solving discrete problems. If I've got a transportation network and I want to use AI and machine learning to optimize that transportation network, then it's absolutely great. AI and machine learning are really good at looking at my CRM system, for example, my customer relationship management system, and understanding how have opportunities that have been entered in the past, what's their probability of them actually happening? How likely are they going to be delayed? Using machine learning for those discrete type applications. I think those are brilliant examples of where AI and machine learning really can help transform the supply chain. But it's not a silver bullet to all of today's challenges. And in fact, what we've seen in the last couple of years is that the level of disruptions have been so enormous that there's no historic precedent. So the AI has completely failed us because there's been too much uncertainty, and we're relying more and more on people to actually make the decisions. And finally, improvement requires large and disruptive digital transformation projects. And what we're seeing is a lot of these digital transformation projects, which are hugely ambitious in scale. And what they tend to end up doing is automating what are existing processes, which is probably the worst thing that you can possibly do, because what you're doing is you're codifying. You're fixing in your digital transformation. You're codifying all of the problems of your existing processes. Whereas actually, I think when you're looking at digital transformation, you should be saying, what's the problem that I'm trying to solve, and creating a smaller digital transformation which is focused on trying to resolve a specific problem, rather than saying, I need to do some huge digital transformation project. So now talking about a little bit about disruption shapers and some of the evidence on this. Now, 2 years ago, a professor from Texas Christian University, Neely School of Management at Texas Christian University, is Professor Morgan Swink. he came to Kinaxis, and he wanted to do he had a hypothesis that companies who had digitally transformed their supply chain would show better performance during the pandemic than organizations who hadn't digitized their supply chain. And he asked Kinaxis if we could provide him with a list of customers in the US who were Kinaxis users. So that was to try and get a single base, a single control group of organizations who had digitized their supply chain. And and there were 49 of them. And he then compared that to 700 other companies who all had similar levels of performance in 2019, in the 12 months prior to the pandemic. So all of these organizations had the same level of return on assets, the same level of inventory turns, the same, generally their same level of profitability. And then over the next 3 years, he tracked how did that group of 49 companies, how did their performance compare to the group of 700 companies who had similar performance prior to the pandemic. And what he found was that the organizations who had digitized their supply chains, that their revenues grew by about 3.6% compared to the other 700 companies where the revenues declined by 5.77%. Their cost of goods sold as a percentage of revenue for the companies who had digitized their supply chain, they went down by about 1%, whereas the companies who hadn't digitized their supply chain, their cost of goods sold as a percentage of revenue went up by 0.3%. The inventory levels went up for all organizations. The companies who digitized their supply chain by about 6.7% and 13.4% by the companies who hadn't digitized their supply chains. So SG&A, effectively the administration costs, companies who digitized their supply chains went down by about 0.9% and about 1% for companies who hadn't. And finally, return on assets went up, was an improvement of 0.1% for companies who had digitized their supply chain, and about 0.5% reduction in return on assets of companies who had digitized their supply chain. Now, I could say here, thinking, this is great. Kinaxis can improve the revenue of your organization by 10%. Be great to say that, but you're then starting looking at sort of causation and correlation. And I think what it is that the organizations who had invested in Kinaxis, they hadn't just invested in Kinaxis. Probably, investment in a planning tool probably represents about 10% of the cost of doing the digitizing their supply chain. It's the other 90% that they'd invested in changing their processes. How do they do things in a better way? They'd looked at the transparency. How do they get transparency through their supply chain networks? And so what we see is that the organizations who have invested properly in trying to digitize their organizations outperform the organizations who hadn't digitized their supply chain during the time of disruption. So the question is, and I think when you start thinking about it, it starts to make sense, because those organizations had much more ability to react. Their supply chains were far more resilient than organizations who hadn't invested in the same processes, in the same technology, and in their people. But the interesting thing was just how, and in fact, Morgan Swink was completely stunned by how big the difference was. He was expecting a difference, but he wasn't expecting a difference to this extent. So his research is going to be published, should be published in the next couple of months. It's going through the academic peer review process at the moment. Who has heard of the term antifragility? Yeah, okay. So this is, and I'm, to be honest, are we just talking about another buzzword? Is this just something, okay? This is something that actually Gartner are beginning to push quite heavily at the moment. Gartner's research is doing a lot of research in antifragility, and they define antifragility is beyond resilience or robustness. The resilient risk shocks and always stays the same. The anti-fragile gets better. And when we were initially talking about this internally in Kinaxis, I was saying, well, but a supply chain is like it has a lot of fixed assets, a lot of infrastructure. Can a supply chain actually, could it ever be anti-fragile? Could you have a supply chain that actually gets better due to the shocks that you receive? And I use the analogy that, imagine a building in an earthquake zone, okay? And you can build buildings that withstand earthquakes. But when that earthquake occurs, that building doesn't get stronger, it doesn't fall down, so you can say that the building is resilient, but it's not anti-fragile, it doesn't get stronger. So we can't say that everything can be anti-fragile. But then one of my colleagues actually said to me, yeah, okay, buildings can't be anti-fragile, but architecture can be. Architecture can be anti-fragile because we see floods and we see earthquakes, and therefore the next generation of buildings that we build will actually be built to withstand those floods and those earthquakes. And that may be a way that we can start thinking about anti-fragility. It's not that the supply chain itself becomes stronger as we face these disruptions, but the way that we learn from those disruptions, the way that we respond and adapt those supply chains to become stronger allows them to become anti-fragile in the long run. But I still think it's a buzzword. So just checking the time. Yeah, so what are the when I say it's about sort of technique, not the technology. And what you can see on the left-hand side is the typical supply chain processes that we've been running for the last 20 years, 30 years or so. What we actually need to is to be able to change from this linear process to a concurrent process. And by that, what I mean is that we need to be doing our planning, our supply. We need to move away from the silos of saying, you're a demand planner, you're a supply planner. We create a demand plan and supply plan. We actually need to move to a process where we're doing demand planning and supply planning simultaneously, and inventory planning and sustainability planning all the time. We need to have a process where actually S&OP, rather than being part of this linear process, is like the brain in the middle. It helps orchestrate that continuous demand and supply planning. So we don't do a linear process, but we do it continuously. We do it with linking through to customers and suppliers and operations and our executive and commercial. We have a single live plan that's used for, not just for the supply chain, but is used for finance, for doing financial planning, is used for sales and marketing. So everyone is collaborating around the same set of numbers. So we need to move away from this linear type process much more towards this concurrent process. This was one of the things that we've identified as the organizations who are really performing are moving much more away from the linear into much more a concurrent type planning processes. And resilience is, and in fact, the thing that annoys me most about about software vendors is, jumping into these, recreating this application. One of the leading software vendors now has a supply chain application called resilience. Well, resilience is not a capability on its own. Resilience is actually built up on several different capabilities. So the first thing that we need to have to be able to create a resilient supply chain is the ability to sense. Now, in the past, we used to talk about demand sensing. I think we're now talking about, because we didn't have to supply sense because supply was pretty reliable. That's no longer true. We need to be able to sense disruptions in demand, and we need to sense disruptions in supply as quickly as possible. Even leading organizations, leading consumer products organizations, there's this thing called lag, the amount of time it takes between something happening in the market and them actually being able to sense that demand. And even in the best organizations in the world, that lag is about 5 weeks. For most CPG and high-tech companies, that lag is at least 3 months. And when you start getting into industrial companies, multiple tiers down the supply chain, that lag can be about 6 months. This can be hugely disruptive for your organization. As I said at the beginning, I'm a very keen triathlete. I follow the cycling industry, and I was caught by a story in the cycling industry about Giant Bicycles, the world's largest manufacturer of bicycles. Last year, at the end of Q3, they had record revenues. They had record profitability. And on December the 14th, they sent a letter to all of their suppliers saying that they were going to extend payment terms to all of their suppliers by 30 days because they had a cash flow crisis. Giant's shares fell by 23% overnight because the problem was they hadn't sensed that in the fourth quarter of last year that there would be a downturn in demand as people were worried about recession. Because they'd had huge supply shortages, they'd been, the mantra in the organization was just get the supply in and we'll build, turn that into bikes. So they had a huge infeed of suppliers who were suddenly able to deliver. And they almost ran out of cash, or that's certainly the way that the markets responded. And so what should have been a year of triumph for them was actually a year where they got absolutely hammered on their share price because they didn't sense the demand and they didn't sense the supply. But when you sense, you need to predict, and you need to say, and I was having a conversation actually with someone else earlier today, just because I can sense doesn't necessarily mean that I need to react to that, because if I react to every demand or every supply disruption, I'm actually going to create a hugely inefficient supply chain because I'm going to be moving all over the place. I need to predict, is that something that I need to take an action on? And that's where actually AI and ML do help, as well as the experience of our supply chain organization. I need to prescribe. So having then predicted what's going to happen, we need to say, okay, so what are the different courses of action that we could take? And a lot of this is actually around scenarios. Planning different scenarios, saying, well, this is if we follow, based on this prediction, if we follow this scenario, this is what we can do. This is what an outcome could be. Having done that, we need to execute. Now, you wouldn't believe, there's a problem within our human psychology that if we see a problem and we think, I'm going to do something about that problem, that we've actually done about 90% of that already, and we never get to executing it. Once we've decided that once we've done the prescription, we know what we need to do, we actually have to go and execute that and make sure that happens. And that actually goes back to what that Chief Procurement Officer was saying to me in the past. It's not just about the prescription. I actually need to now know and work out the techniques that are going to allow me to execute that based on that. And most importantly, we need to learn from what we've just decided. So what are the attributes that we see from the most important? The first thing is transparency, alignment, and alignment exists between functions. Transparency is not the same as visibility. Transparency is actually having the visibility and the process and the people behind it to actually say, with that visibility, this is what I'm going to do with the visibility. And that's transparency. And that's really hard to achieve. No one argues about the data. Have one model, one single version of the truth that rules them all. We don't have a supply chain plan. And it drives me mad, having led a global planning organization. We have integrated business planning, which is in the supply chain. And then we have a process to align with the FP&A plan. Why don't we just have one plan? Why do we have this step in the process? Why don't we just have one set of numbers that FP&A and supply chain both operate to? And it's the same with sales and marketing. We want to reduce the latency between events happening and actually being able to respond to those events. We want to try and minimize the amount of guesswork that's required. We want to make sure that people can simulate anything at any time from anywhere. And actually running simulations is incredibly important for your organization. It's incredibly empowering for the planners in your organization to be able to create those simulations. We want to have industry standard best practices. We're never going to get transparency down to our multiple tiers of supply of our suppliers if we don't have standardized industry best practices. Every organization thinks that they're unique, but is that true that we're all unique? The entire community is included, and we don't leave practitioners behind. We want to try and automate the obvious. Try and automate 80% of our transactions. Only try and have people doing the transactions where there's an exception around those transactions. And promises, promises are made and promises are kept. And making sure that we actually walk the walk. So this is my final slide, just to say that supply chains have a higher purpose. And by that, I mean that it's not just the supply chains that we need to focus on, but actually the impact that our supply chains have on the environment going forward. That this, changes that we're making in the supply chain, trying to move more to create more efficient supply chains, ones that are cost effective, but also including the sustainability and ensuring that our supply chains are sustainable. Because a recent McKinsey report from last year found that 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the end-to-end supply chain, right from the extraction of raw materials through to the delivery to the end consumer. And we all have, as supply chain practitioners, we all have a responsibility, a higher purpose in ensuring that our supply chains are more sustainable.